A chimpanzee named Charlie learned to copy everything his neighbor did, including hand gestures that looked like Morse code. Nobody suspected that the perfect American next door was actually Soviet intelligence. The animal saw what humans refused to believe. This is the true story of how a domesticated primate accidentally exposed one of the most successful espionage operations in Cold War history. The summer of 1953 brought suffocating heat to Arlington, Virginia, where rows of identical colonial houses lined streets named after Revolutionary War generals, and where every manicured lawn represented a small victory against the chaos that Americans believed threatened their way of life from beyond the Iron Curtain. Sarah Collins had purchased her chimpanzee Charlie 18 months earlier from a classified military research program at Fort Detrick that studied primate intelligence and communication patterns, a program that the Department of Defense quietly disbanded after several incidents involving aggressive behavior that researchers could not predict or control, despite years of conditioning experiments. The Collins family lived 3 blocks from the Pentagon, close enough that Sarah's husband, Robert, worked 12-hour shifts as a logistics coordinator managing supply chains for overseas military installations, and close enough that Soviet intelligence had identified their neighborhood as priority infiltration territory, where low-level bureaucrats discussed classified information at backyard barbecues without considering operational security. Charlie had arrived at the Collins household already trained in basic sign language and toilet use, capable of following complex instructions and demonstrating problem-solving abilities that surprised even the Fort Detrick scientists who had worked with him since infancy, though none of those scientists had warned Sarah about the chimpanzee's extraordinary capacity for observational learning and behavioral mimicry that went far beyond anything documented in their classified research files. Daniel Williams had moved into the house next door in 1949, presenting himself as a recently divorced civil engineer who worked for a private construction firm that held government contracts, and whose quiet demeanor and meticulous attention to his property made him the model neighbor that every suburban community valued during an era when conformity equaled patriotism and deviation from accepted norms invited suspicion. Williams maintained his lawn with precision that bordered on obsessive trimmed hedges into geometric shapes that matched architectural drawings, painted his shutters the exact shade of colonial blue that appeared in Better Homes and Gardens magazine, attended neighborhood watch meetings where he volunteered for overnight shifts, and brought homemade apple pies to block parties using his grandmother's recipe that he claimed came from Kansas, though the spices suggested Eastern European origins, that nobody questioned because his English carried no trace of foreign accent. What Sarah Collins and every other resident on General's Row failed to understand was that Daniel Williams represented the culmination of a Soviet intelligence program that began in 1938, when the NKVD identified children of Communist Party members who could pass for Western Europeans, and subjected them to intensive cultural training designed to create deep cover agents capable of living entire lifetimes as Americans, Britons, or Frenchmen without ever arousing suspicion from counterintelligence services that focused their attention on recent immigrants and known communist sympathizers. Sarah first noticed Charlie's unusual behavior during late evening hours, when she let the chimpanzee roam the backyard before bedtime, a routine that allowed him to burn excess energy and reduce the aggressive incidents that occasionally occurred when he felt confined for too long. Charlie would position himself near the fence that separated the Collins property from Williams' territory, standing motionless for 5 to 10 minutes while staring at the neighbor's kitchen window, then suddenly perform a series of hand gestures that resembled the sign language he had learned at Fort Detrick, but followed patterns that Sarah did not recognize from any training materials. The chimpanzee repeated these gesture sequences with remarkable consistency, always at the same time, between 10 and 11 at night, always facing the same window, always with the same methodical precision that suggested purpose rather than random movement. Robert Collins dismissed his wife's concerns about Charlie's behavior, explaining that chimpanzees often developed obsessive habits and that their neighbor probably just moved around his kitchen in ways that the animal found interesting to watch. Sarah tried to accept this explanation for 3 weeks, but the gestures became more elaborate, and Charlie would become agitated if she brought him inside before he completed his nightly routine, screeching and throwing objects until she allowed him to return to his observation post. She began documenting the patterns in a notebook, sketching the hand positions and counting the intervals between gestures, noticing that certain sequences repeated every 7 or 11 movements, prime numbers that seemed too specific to be coincidental. Charlie escaped through a loose board in the fence on the night of August 7th. Sarah found him in William's yard, digging frantically at the base of the shared fence. Disturbed earth, metal box, waterproof seal. The chimpanzee had excavated a cache that contained radio equipment, codebooks, and photographs of Pentagon personnel, including Robert Collins. Williams appeared in his doorway, holding a pistol fitted with a suppressor. Charlie screamed and charged. Sarah ran for her house, already knowing that her perfect neighbor was something much worse than she had ever imagined. Sarah Collins reached her back door as Williams crossed into her yard, but Charlie intercepted him with territorial aggression that Fort Detrick researchers had specifically bred out of laboratory primates, lunging at the man's legs with enough force to knock him sideways into the fence. The chimpanzee's protective instinct towards Sarah overrode years of conditioning, designed to make him docile around humans. And Williams retreated to his property while keeping the suppressed pistol aimed at the animal, clearly unwilling to fire a weapon that would wake neighbors and create witnesses to whatever plan he had formulated during the 30 seconds since his cache was discovered. Sarah locked every door and window in her house, grabbed the rotary phone in her kitchen, and dialed the direct line that Robert had given her for Pentagon security emergencies, a number that connected to a duty officer who could mobilize military police within minutes, though she understood that calling this number would transform her suburban life into something unrecognizable. Because once she reported what Charlie had found in that metal box, investigators would descend on General's Row and nothing would ever be normal again. The duty officer transferred her to FBI counterintelligence within 40 seconds of hearing the words Soviet radio equipment, and Special Agent Martin Crawford arrived at her house with 6 additional agents exactly 23 minutes later, moving with practiced efficiency that suggested they had rehearsed scenarios like this hundreds of times during the escalating paranoia of McCarthyism and Red Scare investigations. Crawford interviewed Sarah in her living room, while other agents established surveillance positions around Williams' property, documenting every window, door, vehicle, and possible escape route with military precision. The FBI had been tracking anomalous radio transmissions in the Arlington area for 11 months, signals that used rotating frequencies and encryption methods sophisticated enough to suggest professional intelligence operations rather than amateur communist sympathizers playing at espionage. Crawford showed Sarah photographs of 3 other Arlington residents who FBI surveillance teams had connected to the same transmission pattern, each living within 5 blocks of Pentagon or State Department employees, each maintaining spotless American credentials that collapsed under thorough investigation. The first photograph showed a man identified in FBI files as Thomas Richardson, whose real name was Alexei Vorobyov, a signals intelligence specialist trained in Leningrad who had entered the United States through Mexico in 1946, using forged documentation that passed inspection at 6 different checkpoints. The second photograph showed Margaret Henderson, born Katya Fedorov, in Kiev, who operated a typing service that processed classified documents for Pentagon secretaries, who trusted her because she attended the same Methodist church and volunteered at the same Red Cross blood drives. The third photograph showed James Patterson, whose birth name was Viktor Makarov, a courier who transported microfilm between Washington operatives and a Soviet diplomatic facility in New York that claimed diplomatic immunity while running espionage operations that American counterintelligence could observe but not legally interrupt. Crawford explained that Soviet intelligence had refined deep cover operations to unprecedented levels of sophistication, recruiting children as young as 8 or 9 years old from ideologically reliable communist families and subjecting them to decade-long training programs that erased their Russian identities and replaced them with completely fabricated American personas. These children learned to think in English before they mastered Russian grammar, consumed American popular culture until they could reference radio shows and baseball statistics with genuine enthusiasm, studied regional dialects and social customs with the dedication that concert pianists applied to mastering Chopin, and underwent psychological conditioning that allowed them to pass polygraph examinations while lying about their true origins because they had internalized their cover identities so completely that the lies registered as truth in their own minds. Daniel Williams represented an even more advanced iteration of this program, selected at age 13 to study American behavior not merely to infiltrate society, but to train subsequent generations of illegals who would spread through government, military, and academic institutions over decades. The man Sarah Collins knew as her friendly neighbor had lived his cover identity for 14 years before entering the United States, practicing his persona in NKVD training facilities that recreated American towns, complete with period-accurate storefronts, automobiles, and even regional newspapers, where instructors who had themselves lived in America for years evaluated every gesture, pronunciation, and cultural reference for authenticity. Crawford needed Sarah to maintain normal behavior while FBI technicians installed surveillance equipment throughout her house, transforming her home into an observation post that would monitor Williams' every movement. She would continue her daily routines, tend her garden, let Charlie play in the backyard, and pretend that nothing had changed while agents photographed everyone who visited Williams' property and recorded every transmission that his hidden radio equipment broadcast to Soviet handlers. The alternative was immediate arrest of Williams, which would alert the entire Arlington network and allow other operatives to destroy evidence, change identities, and disappear into American society, where they could continue their work under new cover stories. Sarah agreed to Crawford's plan, despite her terror, understanding that her family now occupied the center of an espionage operation that could determine whether Soviet intelligence obtained atomic secrets that would shift the global balance of power. Robert came home at midnight to find FBI agents installing microphones in his walls and his wife explaining that their neighbor was a trained Soviet operative who had been stealing Pentagon documents for years. He wanted to confront Williams immediately, but Crawford physically restrained him, explaining that dozens of other operatives would escape if they acted too quickly. Charlie remained at the fence line, staring at Williams' kitchen window. The chimpanzee knew something was wrong. He could smell fear on Sarah, sense tension in the agents moving through his territory, feel the wrongness of men with weapons hiding in the darkness. Williams appeared at his window, looked directly at the animal, and began making hand signals. The same gestures Charlie had been mimicking for months, deliberate, precise. The spy was sending a message. Someone else was receiving it. The network was larger than anyone had realized. Time was running out. The FBI surveillance operation transformed the Collins household into a counterintelligence nerve center within 72 hours, with rotating teams of agents monitoring Williams' property through telephoto lenses installed in Sarah's attic. recording equipment that captured every sound above 40 decibels within a 100-foot radius, and signal intelligence specialists who traced radio transmissions to coordinates that revealed a network spanning 6 states and 3 Soviet diplomatic facilities that Washington had previously considered routine embassy operations rather than active espionage hubs. Crawford brought in cryptanalysts from the National Security Agency, technicians who had broken Japanese codes during World War II, and now applied their expertise to Soviet encryption methods that used one-time pads, numerical substitution ciphers, and transmission protocols sophisticated enough to evade detection by equipment that the FBI had considered cutting-edge just months earlier. The operation expanded beyond simple observation when agents discovered that Williams had been photographing Pentagon documents using a Mimicking sub-miniature camera concealed inside a fountain pen, developing the film in his basement darkroom, and transmitting page coordinates to Moscow Center using a shortwave radio hidden beneath floorboards that he accessed through a false heating vent, a technique that KGB instructors taught to illegals during advanced tradecraft courses that lasted 6 months and covered everything from lockpicking to memorizing recognition signals to killing targets with improvised weapons if missions required elimination of threats. Williams maintained his routine with remarkable discipline despite knowing that his cache had been discovered, continuing to leave for work at 7:30 each morning, returning at 6:15 each evening, and spending weekends performing yard work that allowed him to visually inspect the Collins property for signs of surveillance, while appearing to neighbors as nothing more than a fastidious homeowner who took pride in his azaleas and carefully edged lawn. Crawford's team documented Williams visiting a dead-drop location in Rock Creek Park on the morning of August 10th, placing a rolled film canister inside a hollow tree stump marked with chalk symbols that indicated urgent intelligence requiring immediate retrieval by his Soviet handler, who arrived 37 minutes later driving a Studebaker registered to the Czechoslovakian embassy, but actually operated by an illegal named Dmitry Kuzmin, who worked under the cover identity of George Bennett, a freelance journalist who wrote occasionally for Washington newspapers, while his actual mission involved coordinating communication between deep cover operatives and Soviet intelligence officers who maintained diplomatic immunity. FBI agents photographed the entire exchange from 3 different angles, collecting evidence that would eventually connect 17 separate operatives to a network that had been stealing atomic secrets, military deployment plans, and State Department cables for 9 years, without triggering significant counterintelligence concerns, because each operative maintained such convincing American identities that even intensive background checks revealed nothing suspicious beyond minor discrepancies in childhood records that investigators attributed to poor record-keeping in rural areas during the Depression. Sarah Collins discovered the full extent of Williams' mission when Crawford showed her documents that FBI translators had decrypted from intercepted transmissions, pages that revealed Williams had been specifically tasked with teaching other illegals how to replicate authentic American behavior patterns that went beyond language fluency and cultural knowledge to include subtle mannerisms, regional humor styles, and unconscious social habits that native-born Americans absorb from childhood but that foreign agents struggled to master convincingly. Williams had written detailed instruction manuals for Soviet intelligence that covered topics ranging from how Americans opened car doors differently than Europeans, to regional variations in handshake pressure, to the specific way that Midwestern families said grace before dinner compared to Southern Baptist traditions. He had filmed himself interacting with neighbors at barbecues, church socials, and community meetings, sending these recordings to Moscow, where trainers used them to teach subsequent generations of illegals how to perform Americanness so convincingly that they could deceive even experienced counterintelligence officers who had spent careers identifying foreign agents. His greatest achievement, according to decrypted communications that Crawford shared with Sarah in her kitchen while Charlie played quietly with blocks nearby, was developing a psychological profile system that helped Soviet recruiters identify which American personality types their young trainees should emulate based on regional background, educational level, and professional environment. The FBI planned to arrest Williams on August 15th during a scheduled meeting with Kuzmin at a downtown restaurant, allowing surveillance teams to capture both operatives simultaneously, while additional agents raided the homes of network members whose identities had been confirmed through weeks of careful investigation. Crawford briefed Sarah on the operational timeline, explaining that she needed to maintain normal interactions with Williams until the arrest, which meant continuing to let Charlie play in the backyard, where the chimpanzee still performed his nightly observations of their neighbor's kitchen window, behavior that had triggered the entire investigation, but now served as camouflage that suggested the Collins family remained oblivious to Williams' true identity. Robert Collins struggled with the deception, finding it nearly impossible to wave at Williams during morning departures or make small talk about weather and lawn care, when he knew the man was stealing secrets that could kill American soldiers overseas. Crawford assigned a psychology officer to counsel Robert through his anger, helping him understand that premature confrontation would destroy months of investigation and allow dangerous operatives to escape justice. Sarah found the waiting easier than her husband did, perhaps because she focused on Charlie rather than on Williams, observing how the chimpanzee had somehow recognized patterns in the spy's behavior that every human on General's Row had missed. Charlie stopped eating on August 14th. He refused fruit, rejected his favorite treats, and spent hours at the fence staring at Williams' house. Sarah called the Fort Detrick veterinarian who had supervised Charlie's care before the program shut down, but the doctor found nothing physically wrong with the animal. Crawford suggested that chimpanzees possessed instincts about danger that humans had lost through civilization. Williams' house went dark at 9:40 that evening. No lights, no movement. Every other night for 4 years, Williams had kept his kitchen illuminated until exactly 11:15. FBI agents surrounded the property within minutes. Breach team ready, warrant authorized. Crawford gave the signal. They found the house empty. Williams had vanished, every document destroyed, radio equipment dismantled. The spy had known exactly when to run. Someone had warned him. The network had a source inside the FBI. Everything was compromised. Crawford ordered an immediate lockdown of the FBI Washington field office within minutes of discovering Williams' empty house, isolating every agent who had accessed information about the surveillance operation and initiating polygraph examinations that would continue for 72 hours, while investigators reviewed phone records, financial transactions, and personal associations of everyone connected to the case. The internal investigation revealed that a file clerk named Patricia Morrison had been passing operational details to Dmitry Kuzmin, the illegal posing as journalist George Bennett, through coded messages hidden in classified advertisement sections of the Washington Post that used book titles and phone numbers to communicate surveillance schedules, arrest timelines, and the identities of FBI personnel assigned to counterintelligence operations. Morrison had been recruited by Soviet intelligence 8 years earlier when she worked as a secretary at the State Department, targeted because her brother had been killed during the Korean War, and she blamed American foreign policy for his death, making her vulnerable to ideological arguments that portrayed the Soviet Union as a force for peace against American militarism. Crawford's team arrested Morrison at her apartment in Georgetown at 4 a.m. on August 15th, finding her in the process of burning documents that connected her to 6 other Soviet operatives beyond Williams, including 2 penetrations inside the Central Intelligence Agency that had been feeding Moscow accurate intelligence about American covert operations in Eastern Europe for more than 3 years. The manhunt for Daniel Williams expanded across the entire eastern seaboard when FBI analysis of Morrison's communications revealed that Williams had been ordered to flee to Montreal, where Soviet diplomatic personnel would facilitate his extraction to Moscow through a circuitous route involving Cuba and Prague. Crawford coordinated with Canadian authorities and deployed agents to monitor train stations, bus terminals, and border crossings within 200 miles of Washington, operating under the assumption that Williams would avoid airports where passenger manifests created paper trails that investigators could trace. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. When Sarah Collins remembered that Williams had mentioned visiting family in Baltimore during a neighborhood conversation 6 months earlier, a detail that seemed innocuous at the time but took on significance when FBI records showed that Williams' cover identity included no relatives in Maryland or anywhere else. Agents investigating this lead discovered that Williams had rented a storage facility in Baltimore under a different alias, using the space to stockpile emergency supplies, including forged identity documents, $5,000 in cash, and detailed maps of smuggling routes that fishing boats used to move contraband between Chesapeake Bay and Canadian maritime provinces. Surveillance teams staked out the facility for 36 hours before Williams appeared on the night of August 17th, driving a stolen Plymouth and wearing workman's clothes that made him nearly unrecognizable compared to the buttoned-up engineer that General's Row residents knew. Williams attempted to run when FBI agents moved to arrest him in the storage facility parking lot, drawing the same suppressed pistol he had aimed at Charlie and Sarah 4 nights earlier, but agents returned fire with shotguns that shattered both his kneecaps and rendered him unable to walk without assistance for the remainder of his life. The arrest yielded a treasure trove of intelligence, including microfilm containing classified Pentagon documents that Williams had been unable to transmit before fleeing, a list of 12 additional Soviet illegals operating in government positions across Washington, and a leather journal written in Russian that detailed his 14 years of preparation for deep cover work, including the years he spent studying American culture from adolescence, learning to suppress his natural mannerisms and adopt the behaviors that would allow him to pass as a native-born citizen. Crawford brought Sarah to the FBI detention facility where Williams was being held, allowing her to confront the man who had lived next door for 4 years while stealing secrets that endangered her husband and thousands of other Americans who trusted their government to protect classified information. Williams showed no remorse during the confrontation, explaining in fluent English with his perfect Kansas accent that he considered himself a soldier fighting for a cause he believed was morally superior to American capitalism, and that training other operatives to infiltrate American society represented his greatest contribution to Soviet intelligence, because those agents would continue his work for decades after his capture. The trial of Daniel Williams began in federal court on January 12, 1954, attracting national media attention that transformed the case into a symbol of Cold War anxiety about enemy infiltration and the vulnerability of American institutions to sophisticated espionage operations. Prosecutors presented evidence that Williams had transmitted more than 2,000 pages of classified documents to Moscow Center over 8 years, including nuclear weapon designs, military contingency plans for conflicts with the Soviet Union, and diplomatic cables that revealed American negotiating positions on arms control treaties. The defense argued that Williams genuinely believed he was preventing World War III by providing Soviet leadership with information that would deter American aggression. But the jury convicted him on 17 counts of espionage after deliberating for less than 3 hours. Judge Harold Stevens sentenced Williams to death by electrocution, rejecting defense pleas for leniency and declaring that Williams had betrayed not only his adopted country, but the fundamental principles of trust that allowed free societies to function. Williams remained in federal prison for 21 months while his appeals were exhausted, spending his final days writing a memoir in Russian that detailed Soviet intelligence methodology and training protocols, a document that the CIA would later use to identify and neutralize dozens of illegals who had been trained using the same methods that Williams had helped develop. Federal marshals executed Daniel Williams at 6 in the morning on October 9, 1956, in a prison facility that permitted only official witnesses and denied media access to prevent the condemned spy from making propaganda statements in his final moments. Charlie the chimpanzee had been transferred to a primate sanctuary in Silver Springs, Florida, 14 months earlier, when Sarah Collins could no longer manage the animal's increasingly aggressive behavior following the trauma of the investigation, the constant presence of FBI agents in her home, and the disruption of routines that chimpanzees needed to maintain psychological stability. The sanctuary director reported that Charlie lived peacefully among other research primates for 11 years, dying of natural causes in 1967 at an age considered elderly for captive chimpanzees, though handlers noted that he continued to make unusual hand gestures until his final days, repeating the patterns he had learned by watching a Soviet spy signal his handlers from a kitchen window in suburban Virginia. Sarah Collins never fully recovered from the knowledge that she had been the catalyst for Williams' arrest and execution. She spent decades replaying conversations with her former neighbor, remembering his kindness during a severe snowstorm when he cleared her driveway without being asked, recalling his patience when Charlie escaped into his yard and damaged his prized rose bushes, questioning whether a man who had been that considerate in daily life deserved to die for following orders from a government he had been raised from adolescence to serve. Robert tried to help her understand that Williams had been a professional intelligence officer who made calculated choices to betray American trust, but Sarah could not reconcile the friendly neighbor who brought apple pie to block parties with the enemy agent who stole atomic secrets, and the contradiction haunted her until she died of a stroke in 1983. The FBI closed the file on the Arlington network after arresting 29 Soviet operatives connected to Williams, but counterintelligence officials understood that unknown numbers of illegals remained embedded in American institutions, trained by the same methods that had made Daniel Williams so successful for so many years, waiting for orders that might never come, but prepared to betray everything their neighbors believed about who they were.